There's a common myth that attraction is all about intensity, chemistry, passion, that electric spark you can't explain. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, those things can actually push them away faster than they pull them in. What truly draws them closer isn't loud or obvious. It's subtle, psychological, and deeply disarming. These are the quiet triggers that make them feel safe enough to lean in, sometimes without even realizing it themselves. And when you understand these, you stop chasing attraction and start becoming it. When someone has avoidant tendencies, emotional safety isn't just attractive, it's regulating. It's the difference between them feeling like they can stay present with you or feeling like they need to escape to protect themselves. And most people completely misunderstand this. They assume attraction is built through intensity, through emotional highs, through deep talks that move too fast or feelings that are expressed too strongly too soon. But for an avoidant person, that level of emotional speed doesn't feel romantic. It feels like pressure. And pressure is exactly what triggers distance. Emotional safety is built in the opposite way. It's created through a sense of calm predictability in your presence. When you speak, you don't overwhelm them with neediness or emotional urgency. When you connect, you don't make every interaction carry the weight of "what are we?" or "where is this going?" Instead, you create an environment where nothing about you demands an immediate emotional response. And that changes everything. Because for someone who is used to shutting down when things feel too intense, your calmness becomes unfamiliar in the best possible way. Think about what happens inside them when they're around emotional intensity. Even if they like you, even if there's attraction, their nervous system starts to associate closeness with loss of control. They begin to feel like they're being pulled into something they haven't agreed to emotionally yet. So they retreat, not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much too fast. Emotional safety reverses that pattern. It tells their system, you don't have to decide anything right now. You don't have to perform. You don't have to protect yourself. And here's where the real shift happens. When someone who is used to bracing themselves in relationships suddenly feels no need to brace, they start to lower their guard without realizing it. You're not asking them to open up, you're showing them that opening up won't cost them their freedom. That's why emotional safety is so powerful. It doesn't push for vulnerability, it invites it indirectly through trust. But emotional safety also requires something subtle from you: restraint. Not emotional suppression, but emotional pacing. It means you don't over-explain your feelings in a way that forces them to match your intensity. You don't rush connection to reassure yourself. You stay grounded in your own emotional center. And ironically, that steadiness becomes the very thing that makes you feel emotionally trustworthy to them. Over time, this creates a psychological contrast they don't easily forget. Most connections they experience feel like escalation or pressure at some point. But with you, things feel spacious. They feel unforced. And that space doesn't push them away. It pulls them in slowly because it feels safe enough to explore without consequences. And the deeper truth is this: avoidant individuals don't resist love. They resist the feeling of losing themselves inside it. Emotional safety is what removes that fear. It's what tells them, quietly and consistently, that closeness with you doesn't require sacrifice of self. And once that belief takes root, attraction stops being something they run from and starts becoming something they lean into. Independence is one of those things that sounds simple on the surface, but psychologically, it carries a huge amount of weight, especially for someone with avoidant tendencies. Because underneath the surface of avoidance is not a lack of feeling, but a deep sensitivity to dependence, pressure, and emotional entanglement that feels like it could consume their sense of self. So when they meet someone who is independent in a calm, grounded way, it doesn't just feel attractive. It feels safe in a completely different category than emotional connection. What most people get wrong is they confuse independence with distance. They think if they act uninterested, or if they don't reply quickly, or if they appear detached, that it creates attraction. But true independence is not about playing hard to get. It's about being genuinely anchored in your own life so that your emotional world is not revolving around the other person. That distinction is everything. Because an avoidant person is extremely perceptive when it comes to detecting emotional dependency. They can sense when someone is overinvested, when someone is subtly seeking reassurance, when someone is quietly hoping the relationship will become their main source of validation. And the moment they sense that, their internal alarm system activates. But when they meet someone who is truly independent, someone who has their own rhythm, their own priorities, their own emotional stability, they experience something unfamiliar. There is no pressure to become responsible for your emotional state. There is no subtle expectation that they need to show up in a certain way to keep you grounded. Instead, they see someone who is already whole, already engaged in life, already fulfilled in ways that don't depend on them. And that creates psychological relief. Relief is important here, because attraction for avoidant individuals is often filtered through the nervous system before it ever becomes emotional or romantic. If something feels heavy, demanding, or consuming, they withdraw. But if something feels light, self-contained, and non-intrusive, they stay present longer. Independence creates that lightness. It signals, I'm not here to take something from you emotionally. I'm not here to make you responsible for me. And ironically, that is what makes them more curious. Because when someone is not trying to fill a void through them, they begin to wonder what space there might be for connection that doesn't feel suffocating. Independence creates a kind of emotional neutrality that lowers their defenses. They don't feel like they are being pulled into a role. They don't feel like they are being positioned as the answer to someone's emotional needs. Instead, they see someone who could choose connection, but does not need it to feel complete. This is where subtle attraction starts to build, not through pursuit, but through contrast. Because if every other dynamic they've experienced feels like emotional demand at some point, then meeting someone who doesn't operate from that place stands out immediately. It interrupts their expectations. It makes them stay a little longer, think a little deeper, observe without feeling trapped. But there is an important nuance. Real independence is not performed. It cannot be faked through withdrawal or emotional games. In fact, those tactics often do the opposite and create distrust. True independence is calm, consistent self-prioritization. It's being able to enjoy connection without losing yourself in it. It's not needing to constantly check where you stand because your sense of worth is not being outsourced to their responses. And when an avoidant person feels that, when they feel that you are not emotionally dependent on them, but still open to them, it creates a rare psychological combination: safety without pressure, closeness without obligation. And in that space, attraction doesn't feel like something they have to resist anymore. It feels like something they can actually move toward at their own pace. Consistency without pressure is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in attraction, especially with someone who leans avoidant. Because on the surface, consistency sounds like simple reliability, showing up, texting back, being present. But psychologically, it's much deeper than that. It's about creating emotional predictability without creating emotional obligation. And that distinction is exactly what makes the difference between someone feeling safe with you or feeling cornered by you. For an avoidant person, unpredictability in emotional behavior can actually feel less threatening than intense consistency paired with expectation. If someone shows up strongly one moment and then suddenly demands emotional closeness or clarity the next, it creates pressure. But when someone is consistently present in a calm, grounded way, without escalating emotional demands, it begins to rewire how closeness is experienced. It stops being associated with pressure and starts being associated with stability. Most people sabotage this without realizing it. They show consistency, but it's loaded with hidden expectation. Every message carries an unspoken question. Are we progressing? Every interaction has a subtle undertone of, do you feel the same yet? And even if those words are never said out loud, the emotional energy behind them is felt. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to this kind of emotional subtext. They don't just listen to what you say, they feel what you want underneath it. And if what you want feels like it's moving faster than their comfort allows, they start to pull away. Consistency without pressure removes that hidden weight. It's when you show up without trying to extract reassurance. It's when you engage without trying to accelerate the relationship. You're not inconsistent or confusing, you're steady. But your steadiness doesn't come with emotional demands attached. That's what makes it feel safe instead of suffocating. Think about the psychological experience from their side. If someone is inconsistent, they feel uncertain. If someone is intense, they feel overwhelmed. But if someone is consistent without pressure, they experience something they are not used to: emotional space that doesn't disappear. And that space becomes intriguing rather than threatening, because now they don't have to brace for emotional escalation every time you appear. There's also something very powerful happening underneath this. Trust builds in the absence of demand. When someone realizes that your consistency isn't tied to controlling outcomes or forcing clarity, they begin to relax. They stop associating your presence with expectation. And when expectation disappears, resistance starts to lower. Not because they're being convinced, but because their nervous system no longer interprets you as a source of pressure. But consistency without pressure also requires emotional maturity on your part. It means you don't punish distance with withdrawal. You don't use silence as leverage. You don't try to teach lessons through unpredictability. Instead, you remain grounded in your own rhythm. You show up because that's who you are, not because you're trying to secure a response. That energy is felt deeply, even if it's not consciously recognized. And over time, something subtle starts to happen. The avoidant person begins to associate you with emotional steadiness. You are not the person who overwhelms them. You are not the person who disappears dramatically. You are not the person who creates emotional spikes they have to recover from. Instead, you become the person who feels the same whether things are uncertain or not. That emotional neutrality is rare. And rarity creates value, not in a superficial sense, but in a psychological one, because it gives them the experience of connection without emotional captivity. They don't feel trapped, but they also don't feel alone when you're present. And that balance is what slowly shifts attraction from resistance into openness. So consistency without pressure is not about doing more. It's about removing the emotional weight behind what you do. It's showing up in a way that says, I'm here and I'm not here to chase you into anything. And for someone who has spent most of their relational experience guarding themselves from emotional demands, that kind of presence doesn't push them away. It quietly draws them closer over time. Mystery is one of those concepts people often misunderstand, especially when it comes to attraction. Most assume it means being unpredictable, withholding information, or creating emotional confusion on purpose. But with someone who has avoidant tendencies, that kind of manufactured mystery doesn't create attraction, it creates anxiety. And anxiety in their internal world is something they move away from as fast as possible. True mystery is something far more subtle. It's not about hiding who you are. It's about revealing yourself in layers at a pace that feels natural rather than forced. It's the difference between being unreadable and being gradually discoverable. And for someone who is avoidant, that difference determines whether they lean in or shut down. Avoidant individuals are not actually scared of depth. They are cautious about emotional overwhelm. So when someone comes in too fast, too intense, too exposed from the beginning, it removes the sense of discovery. Everything is already laid out. There's no space to explore, no space to adjust, no space to feel safe in curiosity. Instead, it feels like emotional speed dating with no breathing room. And when breathing room disappears, so does their interest. Grounded mystery creates the opposite effect. It allows them to feel that there is more to you than what is immediately visible, but without making them feel like they are being kept out. You are present, you are open, but you are not overexposed. You share parts of yourself naturally in conversation, not as a strategy to impress or secure attachment, but as a reflection of your own pacing. And that pacing is what makes you feel emotionally safe yet intriguing at the same time. From a psychological perspective, this kind of mystery activates curiosity rather than defense. Because the avoidant mind is constantly scanning for emotional risk, it reacts strongly to anything that feels like pressure to figure someone out quickly. But when there is no urgency, when there is no emotional demand to define the connection immediately, curiosity has space to grow. They start to wonder about you without feeling forced to engage deeper than they are ready for. What makes grounded mystery powerful is that it is not performative. You are not trying to create intrigue. You are simply not overextending yourself emotionally too soon. You are not dumping your entire emotional world on someone before trust has been established. You are not using vulnerability as a shortcut to closeness. Instead, you are allowing trust to build at a pace that feels natural, which means your depth reveals itself over time, not all at once. And that gradual unfolding is where attraction starts to build for someone who is avoidant. Because now, being around you doesn't feel like an emotional flood. It feels like discovery. There is always something new to understand, not because you are inconsistent, but because you are layered. And layered presence is far more sustainable for someone who struggles with emotional overwhelm. Another important element is that grounded mystery requires self-security. If you are anxious, if you are constantly trying to secure reassurance, your energy will naturally become exposed too quickly. You will overshare, overexplain, overconnect in an attempt to stabilize uncertainty. But when you are internally steady, you don't rush connection to calm your own discomfort. You let things develop. And that patience changes the entire dynamic. Over time, this creates a very specific experience for the avoidant person. They don't feel like they've been pulled into something they can't escape. Instead, they feel like they are choosing to step closer, bit by bit, on their own terms. And choice is everything for them. When attraction feels like pressure, they withdraw. But when attraction feels like curiosity, they can safely follow. They stay engaged longer. So grounded mystery is not about being distant. It's about being complete without being fully revealed all at once. It's about letting connection grow in depth instead of forcing it into immediacy. And in that space, where there is clarity without full exposure, presence without overwhelm, that's where an avoidant person begins to feel something they don't experience often: safe curiosity. And safe curiosity is often the beginning of real emotional investment. Respecting someone's space sounds simple, but in practice, it's one of the most emotionally misunderstood dynamics in attraction, especially with avoidant individuals. Because most people either overstep space by trying to stay constantly connected, or they weaponize space by disappearing to create tension. Neither approach builds real attraction. In fact, both usually increase emotional resistance. What actually creates movement is a very different energy: respect that is calm, secure, and completely free of manipulation. For someone with avoidant tendencies, space is not just a preference, it's part of how they regulate emotional closeness. When they feel too much emotional proximity too quickly, their instinct is to pull back, not because they don't care, but because their system equates closeness with pressure. So when you respect their space in a grounded way, without guilt, without punishment, and without emotional games, you are essentially telling their nervous system you are safe to come and go without consequences. That feeling is rare for them. Most relational experiences come with hidden strings attached. If they don't reply quickly, there is tension. If they take space, there is withdrawal or passive aggression. If they step back, they feel like they are losing something, so they learn to associate space with risk. But when they meet someone who doesn't react emotionally to their distance, something important shifts. Space stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like neutrality. But here is where most people get it wrong. They think respecting space means becoming distant themselves. So they pull away, they become inconsistent, or they mirror avoidant behavior in hopes of creating attraction. But that is not respect, it is emotional avoidance disguised as strategy. And avoidant individuals can sense the difference immediately. What actually builds trust is not withdrawal, but steadiness. You remain emotionally available, but not intrusive. You stay grounded, but not demanding. That balance is what changes everything. Because now space is not something they have to fight for or protect against you. It exists naturally within the connection. They don't feel chased, but they also don't feel abandoned. And that middle ground is where emotional safety begins to form. Another important layer is emotional non-reactivity. When you respect someone's space, you are also communicating that their need for distance does not threaten your self-worth. You are not collapsing emotionally when they step back. You are not overanalyzing every gap in communication. You are not turning silence into rejection. Instead, you are allowing space to exist without attaching panic to it. This is incredibly powerful for an avoidant person because it breaks a pattern they are used to: space leading to emotional consequences. When that pattern is broken, they start to relax their defenses. They begin to see that being close to you does not require constant emotional management. They don't have to overthink their behavior. They don't have to carefully regulate how much or how little they give to avoid triggering you. And slowly, something very subtle begins to happen. They start to return on their own. Not because they feel pressured, and not because they are being chased, but because they don't feel controlled. Your presence remains steady even in their absence, and that steadiness becomes a reference point for safety. But perhaps the most important part of respecting space is intention. If you are doing it as a tactic, waiting for them to come back, hoping they will miss you, trying to create emotional leverage, it will eventually collapse. Because intention always leaks through behavior. Genuine respect for space comes from emotional security within yourself. It means you are not measuring your worth by their proximity. You are not turning their distance into a personal story of rejection. And when that is truly the energy you bring, the entire dynamic changes. Space no longer creates separation, it creates breathing room. And in that breathing room, avoidant individuals begin to experience something they are not used to in relationships: connection without pressure, presence without demand, closeness without loss of self. That is what makes them come back: not force, not pursuit, not emotional intensity, but the rare experience of being allowed to exist freely within connection. Calm confidence is one of those qualities that doesn't announce itself loudly, but it changes everything in how someone experiences attraction, especially someone with avoidant tendencies. Because underneath avoidant behavior is often a nervous system that is highly reactive to emotional intensity, unpredictability, and pressure. So when they encounter calm confidence, it doesn't just feel different emotionally, it feels different physiologically. It creates a sense of steadiness in a space where they are usually expecting tension. Most people confuse confidence with volume. They think it's about being bold, expressive, dominant in conversation, or constantly proving self-worth. But calm confidence has nothing to prove. It doesn't escalate to be seen. It doesn't chase validation. It doesn't shift shape based on the other person's reactions. Instead, it remains anchored, even when the emotional environment around it is uncertain. And that anchoring effect is exactly what makes it so powerful for someone who tends to pull away when things feel emotionally charged. When you are calm in your confidence, you are essentially communicating without words that your emotional world is not dependent on external validation. You are not scanning for approval in every interaction. You are not overanalyzing responses. You are not trying to control the direction of connection to reduce your own anxiety. And this internal steadiness is deeply noticeable even if it's not consciously recognized. For an avoidant person, this creates a very specific psychological experience. They are used to relationships where emotional energy rises quickly, where intensity often leads to expectation, and expectation leads to pressure. So their instinct is to either match the intensity and feel overwhelmed, or withdraw to protect their autonomy. But calm confidence interrupts that pattern entirely. It doesn't demand escalation. It doesn't require emotional performance. It simply exists, steady and unshaken. And because it doesn't demand anything, it becomes safe to be around. Safety is not always about softness or emotional expressiveness. It's about predictability without pressure. When someone is calm in themselves, you don't feel like you have to manage their emotions. You don't feel like you are responsible for their reactions. You don't feel like one wrong move will trigger emotional consequences. That is incredibly relieving for someone who is used to overthinking relational dynamics. But there is another layer here that is just as important. Calm confidence naturally removes chasing energy. And chasing energy is one of the fastest ways to trigger avoidance. When someone is constantly trying to secure reassurance, constantly trying to close emotional gaps, constantly seeking clarity too soon, it creates a subtle but persistent feeling of being emotionally pursued. Even if there is attraction, that feeling can cause withdrawal. Calm confidence eliminates that dynamic because it is not driven by emotional urgency. Instead, it operates from a place of internal sufficiency. You are engaged but not dependent. You are interested but not destabilized by uncertainty. You are present but not desperate for immediate definition. And this changes the entire emotional tone of interaction. The avoidant person no longer feels like they are the stabilizer of the connection. They feel like they are simply part of it, not responsible for holding it together. Over time, this creates a very powerful contrast. Most emotional experiences they have involve some level of tension, either too much intensity or too much withdrawal. But calm confidence introduces something different, emotional steadiness without demand. And that steadiness becomes memorable. It becomes grounding. It becomes something their nervous system begins to associate with relief rather than threat. And here is the subtle shift that often happens without either person realizing it. When someone consistently embodies calm confidence, the avoidant individual starts to lower their guard. Not because they are being convinced and not because they are being pursued more effectively, but because the emotional environment no longer triggers their defense system in the same way. They don't feel emotionally cornered. They don't feel pressured to retreat. They don't feel like closeness comes at the cost of control. Instead, they begin to experience something rare in their relational pattern, connection that feels stable even in uncertainty. And that stability slowly replaces resistance with curiosity. They start to stay a little longer in conversations. They start to return more naturally. They start to engage without feeling the need to protect themselves as strongly. And at the center of all of that is calm confidence. Not as a performance, but as a way of being that says, I am grounded in myself, and I don't need to lose that grounding to connect with you.